Welcome to Westwind Tales, where the wild frontier meets the deepest human heart. Stories of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds that hold us together, told the way only the Old West can tell them. She walked away from the roaring crowds, the fame, the glory, and chose a life of chalk dust and children's laughter. But when darkness rode into her quiet town, demanding blood money and threatening the only thing she ever truly loved, she had a choice: run or stand. What happened next in that little schoolhouse changed everything, for her, for the children, and for every soul in Eagle's Crossing who had given up on tomorrow. Today's story reminds us that true strength isn't found in the barrel of a gun. It's found in the quiet choice to protect what matters, no matter the cost. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon anyone carries is love. If this story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Westwind Tales so the next story finds you before it finds someone else.
The peaceful lesson was over. The winter sun had already started sinking behind the mountain, stretching long, skinny shadows over the snow-covered lane of Eagle's Crossing. Inside that small schoolhouse, the last of the daylight filtered through the icy windows, laying down stripes of pale gold on the scuffed pine floor. The room smelled like chalk dust, the pine burning in the stove, and that wonderful scent of clean paper. Outside, the snow was coming down with a steady quiet, wrapping the whole world in a blanket of white. It had been like that for months, ever since the last mine shut down and the town started to empty out. You could see it in the vacant saloons and the boarded-up shops, families just vanishing like ghosts. Kate Landry perched on the corner of her big desk, her hand resting gently on the book in Cody Blaine's lap. The boy was skinny for being 8 years old. You could almost see his ribs through his mended shirt. He was slowly tracing the letters with a dirty finger, his brow all wrinkled up with effort. He whispered the word, "Remember," handling each sound carefully, like it was fragile. "Remember the way home." Kate's voice was low and soft like a hum. "That is right, Cody. Take your time. You are getting the hang of it now." He glanced up at her, and the little victory on his face was warmer than the dying light. All the other desks around them were empty. The other kids had bundled up and headed for home an hour ago, but Cody always asked to stay. Just one more page, just one more try to make the words his own. In a place that had given up on tomorrow, that little boy figured words could take him somewhere the mines couldn't. Kate was about to point to the next sentence when the main door flew open with a bang like a gunshot. A blast of freezing air cut through the warm room, bringing with it the smell of damp leather, chewing tobacco, and men who needed a bath. 3 figures crowded the entrance, their boots mashing muddy slush onto her clean floors. Their spurs made a jangling sound, sharp and out of place. The man in the lead, a big fellow with a new scar down his face that looked like a poorly sewn seam, stopped right inside and let his eyes roam the room, taking his sweet time to insult everything he saw. Rafe. Kate knew trouble when she saw it. She gently closed the reading book, placed it on her desk, and got to her feet. She moved slow and easy, not showing any hurry. It was the same calm she used when a student was about to have a cry or a math problem was getting the best of them. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was steady and polite, every bit the school teacher. "School is out for the day." Rafe's mouth twisted into a smirk. "We are not here to learn to read, ma'am." He took a step into the room. The floor complained loudly beneath his boots. "We are here to talk business, the protection kind." The 2 men with him spread out. One leaned back against the wall by the coat hooks, while the other one blocked the doorway, making sure no one could leave. Their hands stayed close to their pistols, a comfortable, well-practiced habit. Rafe picked up a math book from a student's desk, flipped through it hard enough to bend the pages, and then just let it fall. The book landed on the floor with a sad, flat slap. "Fancy books," he grunted. "Looks like the school board has money to burn." Kate stood her ground. "Every last cent is on the books. The town records are public." Rafe let out a dry little laugh that had no joy in it. Records can't stop bad things from happening, like a fire or broken windows. It would be a real pity if this nice little schoolhouse burned down in the dead of winter. Cody pressed himself against Kate's legs, his little hands grabbing a piece of her long skirt. She put her hand on his shoulder, trying to give him some of her steadiness, even though her own heart had started to pound against her ribs like a drum. "Cody," she said in a low voice, "it is time for you to go home. Your mother will be worried." The boy's gaze darted between her and the menacing men, his eyes wide with fear. The man standing guard at the door did not even bother to move. Kate gave Cody the tiniest of nods. "Go ahead." Cody clutched his writing slate and his book to his chest and scrambled past the men, his boots scraping on the floor. The door shut behind him with a quiet little thud. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the building, and you could hear a lone coyote yipping somewhere up on the ridge. Kate stood up a little taller, putting herself right between Rafe and her desk. Inside a hidden drawer lay her derringer, small, black, and heavy with old memories. She had not laid a hand on it since Denver, not since the roar of the last crowd had faded, and she had locked away that part of her life in a big trunk and ridden off. She surely did not want to touch it now. "Welcome to the Eagles Crossing School," she said, her voice still perfectly even. "Was there something particular I could do for you, gentlemen?" Rafe's scarred mouth curled up. "As a matter of fact, Miss Landry, there is. We here tell of all your new things. New books, new ways of teaching, expensive things." He waved a hand at the tidy rows of desks, the alphabet chart she had drawn herself, and the small shelf of library books she had worked so hard to gather. "Times are tough. People need to make sure their property is safe from accidents." He swiped a stack of primers off another desk, the little books scattered across the floor like a flock of frightened quail. Kate's hand jumped just once, a quick little motion, before she forced it still again. She had stood in the spotlight before, in front of crowds of rough men, and she had learned how to wait out that moment when bad thoughts turned into bad actions. Patience had always been her best weapon. "I believe it is time for you to go," she said. Her words had the same quiet power she used to calm down a rowdy classroom. "Right now." Rafe took a step closer. His breath smelled foul, like old whiskey and stale smoke. "Now that is not very neighborly, teacher. We are just here to discuss a business deal. Bad things happen to folks who do not have protection." His hand drifted down to rest on the handle of his pistol. It was a slow, deliberate motion, meant to be a warning. Kate's heart hammered against her ribs. The derringer was just 2 steps away. Against 3 armed men, it was not much. But Cody was already on his way down the snowy street. And there were 28 children who would come through that door in the morning expecting her to teach them. There was this life she had picked for herself. Quiet, important, and a long way from cheering crowds and the smell of gunpowder. She decided to play for time. "How much?" Rafe grinned. He could feel her giving in. $50 a month should be enough to keep things peaceful for the time being. The amount was pure thievery. It was more than she earned in 2 months, and they both knew it. "The school cannot afford that," she stated plainly. "And this is not about money. This is about proving to this town that you can get to anyone, even the children." Rafe's expression turned to stone. "Be careful, ma'am. That sounds like you think we are not friendly." His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun. The man by the door started to draw his own weapon, slow and arrogant, like a man who knew he held all the cards. But Kate moved. Her hand found the derringer, and in one fluid motion she raised it and fired. The shot cracked through the room like a bolt of lightning. The man's revolver flew from his hand, spinning through the air before it hit the wall. A piece of wood splintered right by the door frame. Rafe was quick on the draw, quicker than most, but Kate was already diving behind the solid oak desk. His bullet ripped through the very spot where she had been standing just a second before. In the sudden quiet, she could hear them gasping for air. They never saw a fight coming. They certainly did not expect a shooter. Kate stayed low, the derringer held firm in both hands, her chest tight. The classroom now smelled of spent gunpowder and burnt wood. "That was a warning shot," she called out, her voice as steady as if she were taking attendance. "The next one will not be. And gentlemen, I have never missed twice." Rafe roared, "Get her!" His next shot was wild because Kate's second bullet had already shattered the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. Kerosene sprayed everywhere, and the flame died. The room plunged into a thick, sudden darkness, with only the pale moonlight from the broken window to see by. She moved to a new spot, her feet guided by years of practice in the dark. One of Rafe's men cursed. "Good Lord, what a shot!" Rafe's voice was thin now, full of a new fear. "It is just luck. No schoolteacher can shoot like that. Find her." A small, cold smile touched Kate's lips in the darkness. "Actually," she said, her voice seeming to come from all around them, "I am not just any schoolteacher." She let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "Perhaps you have heard of Swift Kate, from Colonel Boone's Frontier exhibition." The name landed like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. Rafe's breathing became quick and shallow. "You are lying," he hissed, but all the confidence was gone from his voice. Kate slipped through the dark, as silent as a shadow. "Am I?" she asked, her tone almost gentle. "Or maybe I just found myself a different kind of audience." Another flash of gunfire lit the room. The man near the back wall shot blindly. The bullet slammed into the blackboard right where she had been. Her reply came in an instant, a single shot that popped his hat right off his head. He let out a high-pitched yelp of pure terror. "A quarter of an inch above your hair," she said, her voice calm. "I could have aimed lower. Do you want to find out?" The sound of boots running for the door was his answer. Rafe let out a raw curse. Kate focused all her attention on him. He was the real threat now, shamed and trapped. She heard him shuffling toward the window, trying to get a better look in the moonlight. "Do you know what your mistake was today?" she asked, her voice as casual as if they were discussing his homework. "Tell me," he snarled. "You thought that just because I left the show, I stopped practicing my aim." The silence stretched out. 5 years of teaching had not erased 20 years of knowing how to handle a gun. She moved like smoke and fired the gun. The bullet smacked Rafe's revolver right out of his grip. He stumbled back, shaking his stinging hand. In a sliver of moonlight, Kate stepped out, her derringer held firm. "What is it you want?" Rafe growled, his voice rough. "You will leave Eagle's Crossing," she said plainly, "and you will not return. Go tell your brother that this town, and especially this school, are under my protection. And you remember this?" She stared straight into his eyes, not even blinking. "Some stories you hear about people are true. They just look a little different in person." Rafe shuffled back toward the doorway, all his earlier bluster gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. "This is not over," he mumbled, then disappeared out into the swirling snow. Kate was left alone in the cold darkness, with only the sound of the wind screaming through the shattered window. The little pistol in her hand felt like it weighed a ton. Her hands shook one time, just once, before she willed them to be steady. Outside, new snow was already covering the mess of scattered books and broken wood. She had earned a little peace, but the silence felt brittle, like the quiet right before a storm hits. And she knew, somewhere to the north, Rafe Rohr was riding hard to tell his brother about the secret he had just discovered. Ticked against the busted window pane, like someone drumming their fingers, while the wind outside began to howl through the walls. Inside, the air was a foul mix of gunpowder and kerosene, a sharp, bitter taste that did not belong. Behind the solid oak desk, Kate Landry kept low, the derringer clutched tight in her hands. Her heart pounded against her ribs so hard she swore she could feel it in her jaw. This room, her classroom, smelled all wrong now. The scent of sulfur was mixed in with the familiar smell of chalk dust and pine boards, twisting a place of safety into somewhere strange and dangerous. From near the door, Rafe Rohr's voice sliced through the shadows. $50 a month, teacher lady. That is what it costs to keep bad things from happening. You can pay with money, or you can pay with trouble. Kate stayed quiet for a moment. She just listened. She heard the sound of boots shuffling on the wooden floor, the groan of a leather belt as a man shifted his stance, and the soft jingle of spurs. For years, she had learned to read men just like these on dusty stages, seeing a fight in the set of a shoulder or the twitch of an eye. A part of her hated that she had not forgotten how. Her fingers found the hidden compartment in the desk drawer. The derringer felt small and cold, a familiar weight that made her sick to her stomach. She had promised herself she would never have to use it again. Her purpose here was to teach children arithmetic and reading, not to get into a gunfight. Rafe moved closer. "Did you hear me, miss? It is either $50 or we will be back with fire." The man standing guard by the door let out a nasty little laugh. "The little school ma'am reckons she can reason with us. That is mighty cute." Kate let out a long, slow breath. The day was nearly gone, but one thin ray of light cut through the west window, hitting Rafe square in the eyes. She used that to her advantage. She shifted just a little, making the light blind him, forcing him to squint. "How much was that again?" she asked, her voice calm, just trying to steal a few more seconds. $50, Rafe said with a snap in his voice. "And quit playing games. We have seen the money you get for all these new books." Kate's other hand rested on the edge of the desk. She could just make out the shape of the second man by the door, a dark figure against the last of the evening light. His hand was already moving toward his pistol, much slower and surer this time. This was not what she wanted. But little Cody was somewhere out in that snow, walking home with his first reader held tight to his chest. 28 children were supposed to walk through this door in the morning. If she let these men leave here thinking they had the upper hand, they would just keep coming back, and the next time they might not be satisfied with just breaking things. Her thumb pulled back the hammer on the derringer. It was the man by the door who went for his gun first, his fingers wrapping around the handle. Kate came up just high enough to see, took aim, and fired. The sound was like a cannon blast inside the little room. The man's pistol was knocked from his hand, tumbling through the air before it crashed against the far wall. He cried out, grabbing at his hand where blood was already starting to pour out. Rafe cursed and pulled his own weapon. Kate threw herself to the side, just as his bullet tore through the very spot where her head had been. Wood splinters bit at her cheek. She landed on one knee, brought her pistol around, and fired a second time. The oil lamp hanging from the ceiling exploded. Kerosene flew out in a fiery spray. The flames sputtered and went out. Total darkness fell over the room, with only a faint glimmer of moonlight coming through the broken window. She could hear their panicked breathing. This was not what they were expecting. She moved again, her stocking feet making no sound on the floor. She had kicked her shoes off right after the first shot, using her perfect memory of the room's layout. It was 23 steps to the blackboard, 12 steps to the coat hooks, and 7 steps to the back door. One of Rafe's men whispered, "She is gone. Where in the devil did she go?" "Shut your mouth," Rafe growled back. "She is in here somewhere. Find her." Kate let them worry in the silence for a moment. Then she spoke from the deep shadows over by the potbelly stove. "Actually," she said, her voice quiet but carrying through the dark like a wisp of smoke, "I am not just any little school ma'am." She let the words hang in the air. "It is possible you have heard the name Swift Kate from Colonel Boone's Frontier Exhibition." That name landed with a heavy thud. The sound of Rafe's breathing changed, becoming fast and ragged. "You are lying," he said, but all the confidence was draining out of his voice. Kate moved once more, circling quietly toward the window. "Am I? Or maybe I just found myself a different kind of audience." The man near the back wall just started shooting into the dark. The flash from his gun lit up the room for an instant, long enough for Kate to see the blackboard get chewed up right where she had been standing. Her response was instant. She fired one single, careful shot that sent his hat flying right off his head. He let out a high, terrified squeal and dropped flat on the floor. "That was about a quarter inch above your head," she said, in a calm voice. "I could have aimed a little lower. Would you like to find out?" She heard panicked shuffling. They were not acting so tough anymore. Rafe let out a raw curse. "You think this changes a thing? My brother is going to hear about this. He will bring this whole territory down on top of you." Kate kept moving, quiet as a ghost. She could remember a dusty arena in Cheyenne, the sound of a cheering crowd. She remembered Butcher Roar standing 50 paces away, his face beet red after she had shot every single button off his coat while riding a horse at a full gallop backwards. He had lost the contest, $50, and a brand new hat that day. The memory made her hand feel steady. "Your brother," she said, sounding almost like she was just making conversation. "He still owes me for that hat, and for the buttons. You tell him Swift Kate sends her regards." Rafe gasped. She heard him dragging his boots, trying to get to the door. "You are a crazy woman," he spat. "You think you can fight the Roars? You are just one person." Kate stepped into the faint moonlight, her derringer held perfectly steady. "I am a teacher," she said, "and today's lesson is on learning about consequences." Rafe scrambled backward, his eyes wide, his tough act completely gone. He fumbled around until he found the door handle. "This is not over," he snarled. "My brother is coming, and when he gets here, this whole town is going to burn." He burst through the door and was swallowed up by the snowstorm. Kate was left all alone in the dark. The derringer felt heavier than it ever had before. Her hands gave one single violent shake before she made them stop. She lowered the small gun, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind outside roared louder now, pushing snow in through the shattered window. The white flakes settled on the books strewn across the floor, on the splintered wood of the desks, and on the muddy, bloody footprints left behind. In the distance, she could hear the faint, fading sound of horse hooves pounding through the snow. Rafe was riding north to get his brother. Kate's fingers tightened around the derringer. She looked from the gun down to the schoolroom she had nearly died to protect. The silence felt different now. It was thin and sharp, like the feeling in the air just before lightning strikes. A cold realization settled deep in her bones. She could not pretend anymore. Her past had finally caught up to her, and it was bringing a lot of trouble with it. The schoolhouse felt like it was holding its breath after the gunfire. It was the kind of deep, ringing quiet that comes after a peal of thunder, a silence that feels all wrong. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and soft. It drifted in through the broken window in slow, lazy twists, covering the floor like a layer of fine white ash. The air inside still had the sharp taste of spent gunpowder and burnt wood. A neat little pattern of bullet holes marked the blackboard. School primers were scattered everywhere like dry leaves. A fresh, ugly scar was carved into the heavy oak desk where Rafe's wild shot had hit. In the middle of this mess stood Kate Landry, the small derringer still in her hand. The pistol felt like it weighed 100 pounds, as if it had soaked up the gravity of what she had just been forced to do. Her fingers throbbed from the kick of the gun, and a thin trail of blood ran from a small cut on her cheek. She wiped the blood away with her sleeve, hardly even feeling it. With slow, deliberate movements, she bent down and started picking up the fallen books one by one, as if fixing the room could somehow fix the day. Her hands trembled just a little as she picked up the reading book that little Cody had been so proud of. The page was bent where his small hands had gripped it so tightly on his way out the door. She carefully smoothed the page flat before placing it on the desk with the others. The door creaked open again, much quieter this time, and a pair of boots scraped against the floor. Sheriff Jack Harlan came inside, holding his hat in his hand while snow melted from his coat. He was a tall man, with a face that showed he had seen too many hard winters and made too many tough choices. But his eyes were clear and direct. He looked at the wreckage in the room not with shock, but with the weary understanding of a man who knew violence well. He shut the door behind him to keep out the wind. "Miss Landry," he said, his voice quiet. "I heard shooting. I figured I'd better come and check on things." Kate stood up straight, the derringer still held openly in her hand. There was no use in trying to hide it now. Harland walked carefully through the room, stepping around the scattered schoolbooks. He came to a stop at the blackboard and ran a gloved finger over one of the bullet holes. "Clean shooting," he said softly. "3 shots fired. 1 to disarm a man, 1 to create a distraction, and 1 as a warning. There are not many folks who can shoot that well in the pitch dark." Kate did not say a word. She just placed the last book on top of the pile on her desk. She turned around to face him. Sheriff Harlan's eyes drifted down to the small pistol. "You care to explain what all the fuss was about here?" She let out a long breath. "Rafe and 2 of his boys came by looking for protection money, $50 a month. He mentioned that accidents tend to happen at places without that kind of insurance." Harlan's jaw went tight. "And I reckon you told them no. I told them to get out." He gave a single nod like that made all the sense in the world. "But they didn't go." "No," Kate said softly, "they did not." A quiet moment passed between them. The wind rattled a broken window pane. Harlan looked at her again. He really saw her this time. Not a lot of schoolteachers can shoot like that. Kate's grip tightened on the little gun. "I am not like a lot of schoolteachers." Before Harlan could say another word, the door flew open once more. Cody Blaine stumbled inside, his cheeks red from running, his breath making white clouds in the cold air. His eyes were wide with a mix of fear and determination. "Miss Landry, Sheriff," he stopped, his gaze falling on the ruined room. I was over at the telegraph office after I left. Rafe. He sent a telegraph north to his brother." Kate felt like the whole floor was tilting right under her feet. "Howdy," swallowed hard. It said, "Swift Kate is in Eagles Crossing. Shot Rafe up pretty bad. Bring everyone. The school is open. It is a soft target." Those words just hung there in the room like smoke. Harlan swore under his breath. "Butcher roar. He will show up with 50 men, maybe even more. He has done it before. He burned down an entire town in Montana when the sheriff there refused to pay. He did not leave a single soul alive to tell the story." Kate just stared at the blackboard, at the neat little holes her bullets had made. Her past, the one she thought she had buried deep under lesson plans and chalk dust, was clawing its way back to her. She walked over to the small trunk in the corner, the one she kept hidden under a stack of extra writing slates. She knelt down, lifted a false bottom, and pulled out the Winchester rifle. The gun felt right in her hands, the walnut stock worn smooth from so many years of use. She worked the lever once, a smooth, practiced motion, and checked the chamber, then the magazine. Every movement was automatic, a muscle memory she had tried her best to forget. Cody watched her, his eyes as big as saucers. "Is it true?" he asked in a small voice. "What everyone is saying. Are you Swift Kate from the posters? The one who could shoot a dime clean out of the air?" Kate paused, the rifle resting across her lap. She looked at the boy, and she really looked at him. His face was pale, but she saw no fear in his eyes, just a sense of wonder and trust. She placed the Winchester on her desk. "That was a long, long time ago." She said, "I left that life behind because I wanted something more than just crowds and prize money. I wanted something that mattered." She touched the locket she wore around her neck, the one that held Colonel Boone's medal inside. "Teaching mattered," she said. "It still does." Cody nodded his head slowly. "But if they come," he whispered. Kate looked out the window. The snow was falling thicker now, hiding the ridge from view. She could almost hear the faint echo of Rafe's horse fading as he rode north. "If they come," she said, "we will be ready for them." Harlan stepped a little closer. "The school board is going to want to close it down. Move the children somewhere safe." Kate's hand rested on the Winchester. "The school stays open," she said. "These children have a right to an education. If Butcher Roar wants to threaten that, he will learn exactly why they used to call me the fastest shot west of the Mississippi." Cody's eyes got wide again. Kate turned to him. "I need you to send another telegraph, Cody, to Butcher Roar." The boy stood up a little straighter. "Yes, ma'am." She spoke slowly, making sure every word was clear. Tell him I once split a playing card at 100 yards while standing on a galloping horse. All your men together could not match that shot. Come prove me wrong." She paused for a moment. "Sign it." Swift, Kate. Harland let out a breath through his nose. "You are calling him out." "I am giving him a choice," Kate said. "He can stay away and keep his reputation, or he can come here and lose it, along with anything else I decide to take from him." The sheriff looked at her for a long, hard moment. "The town council will want to have a meeting," he said at last. "This is going to affect everyone." Kate nodded. "Then let them meet. But you make sure they understand. This is not just about me. This is about showing men like the Roars that they cannot rule through fear forever." Harlan put his hat back on. "I will get the word out." He left, the door closing gently behind him. Kate stood there alone with Cody. The boy looked up at her. "You're not going to leave, are you? The school?" Kate put a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said, "I will not." Outside, the wind began to howl. Snow swirled up against the glass. Somewhere off in the distance, the school bell rang just once, a low, sad sound carried on the wind, like a final warning. Kate looked out the window, her hand tightening on the Winchester. The children would be here tomorrow, they always were, and when they got here, they would find the door wide open. But the quiet was not safe anymore. It was just waiting. The shadows were gathering as night fell hard over Eagle's Crossing. It was the kind of dark that seemed to press against the windows like it was alive. The snow was coming down thicker now, blown sideways by a wind that moaned through the pine trees on the ridge and rattled the loose panes of glass in the schoolhouse. Inside, the fire in the stove had burned down low. Only a dull red glow was left, casting long dancing shadows across the splintered floorboards. The smell of black powder still hung in the air, faint but stubborn, mixed with the sharp scent of kerosene from the broken lamp and the clean, cold smell of snow drifting in through the shattered glass. Kate Landry moved through the dim light by herself, her boots quiet on the floor. She had put the desks back in order as best she could, pushing 3 of them together against the front wall to make a low barrier. She was crouched behind it now, sighting down the length of the room towards the door, then shifting her gaze to the side window, figuring all the angles in her head. 23 steps to the coat pegs, 12 to the blackboard, 7 to the back door. The Winchester lay across her lap, its barrel cool against her leg. She had not wanted to touch it again so soon. The weight of it felt like someone was blaming her for something. She stood up, walked to the small trunk in the corner, and lifted the false bottom one more time. The Remington came out next. It had a custom octagonal barrel and a polished walnut stock. The telescopic sight she used to use on exhibition stages glinted just a little in the light from the stove. She worked the lever once, smooth and sure, checked the chamber, and slid cartridges into the magazine with fingers that still trembled just a bit from the earlier fight. Every single motion was automatic, and every single motion hurt. The back door creaked open. Kate spun around. The Remington came up. Nora Hale stood in the doorway, a medical bag in one hand, the other held up with the palm facing out. Snow dusted her shoulders and the brim of her hat. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold. "Easy," Nora said in a quiet voice. "It is just me." Kate lowered the rifle, letting her breath out in a white puff. "You should not be here." Nora stepped inside and shut the door to keep the wind out. "And you should not be alone." She put her bag on a desk and unbuckled it with steady hands. "I brought bandages, morphine, and sutures. If this turns ugly tomorrow, someone is going to need stitching up." Kate just shook her head. "Go home, Nora. Take Cole. Take the children. This is not your fight." Nora looked her right in the eyes. "It is now. Rafe rode out of here bleeding. His brother is not going to let that go. I have treated men from Butcher's crew before. Last year when they passed through, they were professional killers, cold as mountain ice. And I heard what they did up in Montana. A whole town gone, no survivors." Kate's grip got tighter on the Remington. Then you know exactly why you need to leave. I know why I need to stay. Nora closed her bag. You are not doing this by yourself. Before Kate could say anything back, the front door opened again, slow and deliberate. Cole Ramsey stepped inside, holding his hat in his hand, the snow melting off his coat. He carried a lantern held down low, shielding the flame with his palm. Kate, he said, Nora told me I could find you here. Kate let out a long, slow breath. The two of you have got to go. Cole just shook his head. From the top floor of my store, I can see clear down Main Street. The roofs are flat, with good sight lines. I can watch the ways into town and give a signal if they show up. Kate opened her mouth to argue, but the words just stuck in her throat. She looked from Cole to Nora, two folks who had no business at all being in this mess, who had every single reason to be long gone, but they were still here. The back door creaked open a third time. Buck Tanner came limping in. His old cavalry coat was dusted white with snow. He had a Winchester of his own slung right over one shoulder. The lines on his face seemed deeper than usual, and his eyes were sharp as a hawk's despite his age. The roads are quiet, Buck said, but I know all the old mining trails. I used to scout them back during the war. I will watch the Northwest Ridge. I can give you a heads up if they try to come around your flank. Kate just stared at them. Three regular people standing right in her wrecked schoolroom, offering up what little they had. A part of her wanted to shoo them away. She wanted to handle this herself, keep the children safe by keeping everyone else out. But the message Cody sent was already flying north on those thin copper wires. Butcher was on his way, and he was not about to stop with just one little schoolhouse. She set the Remington down on the makeshift barricade. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt like they were not nearly enough. Buck just gave a single nod. We will take turns watching. I will head on out now. I will flash a lantern 3 times if I spot any movement. He turned around and was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Cole waited a moment more. I will be up on that roof by midnight if you need anything at all. Kate managed to give a small nod. Cole followed Buck out into the cold night, but Nora stayed. Kate looked over at her friend. You do not have to do this. I know, Nora said. She opened her bag again and started laying out fresh bandages on a clean piece of cloth. But I am here. A deep silence fell between them, broken only by the whistling wind and the soft crackle of the dying fire in the stove. Kate walked over to the window, picked up the Remington, and pressed her eye to the scope. The special lens gathered up what little moonlight there was, turning the snowy ridge into a world of sharp silver and deep shadow. She scanned the line of pine trees, then the dark opening of the old mining trail. There was nothing. Then she saw a flicker far away and quick. 2 riders moving along the top of the ridge, just dark shapes against the white snow. They stopped for a second, then disappeared behind the trees. Kate slowly lowered the rifle. They are here, she whispered, sooner than I thought. Her fingers tightened their grip on the wooden stock. Nora came and stood right beside her. Scouts? Kate nodded. They are just testing the ways in. The wind picked up again, and on it came the faint, distant sound of horse hooves on the packed snow. It was a slow, steady sound that soon faded back into the night. Kate stared through the scope for another minute, her breath making a fog on the cold lens. If they came with all their men, the school would be the very first thing they hit. The children would be walking right through that door tomorrow morning. She lowered the rifle and rested her forehead against the cold glass of the window. The bell in the school tower rang one time, a low and sad sound, carried on the wind like a warning that no one could afford to miss. Kate closed her eyes for just a second. Then she turned back to the barricade and started checking her angles again. The time for pretending was over. Dawn came slow and gray over Eagle's Crossing, the kind of light that shows you everything but does not warm you at all. The snow had finally stopped sometime during the night, leaving the whole town quiet under a fresh white blanket. No smoke was rising from any chimneys just yet. No dogs were barking. No doors were creaking open. The streets were completely empty, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Inside the schoolhouse, the stove had been brought back to life. A low fire crackled inside, pushing back the biting chill just enough to keep their fingers from getting stiff. The air smelled like pine smoke, old wood, and the sharp metallic scent of gun oil. Kate Landry and Nora Hale worked with hardly a word between them, moving desks with quiet grunts and stacking them up against the walls to make low places to shoot from. Kate would sight down the long barrel of the Remington from each new spot, from a window to the door, from the door to the back stairs, muttering distances to herself. 23 paces, wind coming from the northwest, a drop of 2 inches at 50 yards. Nora watched her for a second and then said softly, "You are doing that just like it is a lesson plan." Kate did not even look up. "It is." She shoved another desk into position, then knelt down to check the line of sight one more time. Her hands were steady now, but that shake from last night was still living somewhere deep down in her chest. She could feel it with every breath she let out. The back door opened with a gust of cold air. Rosalie stepped inside, her scarf wrapped tight around her face, carrying a folded piece of paper. Her dark eyes scanned the barricades without a hint of surprise. "The North Trails," she said, her voice low. "They will come that way if they are looking for an element of surprise. Old mining paths. They are narrow, but a horse can get through." Kate took the paper and unfolded it. It was a rough map showing ridges and winding paths. She gave a single nod. "Thank you, Rosa." Rosa stayed for a moment. "My husband, he ran into those brutes one time. He did not come back." "They will not burn this place," Kate said. "Maybe a little too quickly." Then in a softer voice she added, "Not if we are ready for them." Rosa gave a small, firm nod, and then she was gone. A few minutes later, the front door opened again. Laia Wren slipped in, her arms full of rolled-up parchment. They were maps she had drawn from memory. Old delivery routes were now tactical drawings. She spread one out on a desk. "Main Street," she said. "The high ground is here and the low ground is here. They will probably try to circle around from the livery stable." Kate studied the lines. "Good. We will use the stable roof." Laia paused. "Are you sure about this, Kate? People are mighty scared." Kate looked her right in the eye. "I know." Doc Graves was the next to arrive, shuffling in with his black coat dusted white. He was not carrying any weapons, just a small notebook and a length of heavy chain. "The wall," he said, tapping the thick logs. "These will stop a rifle bullet, but not if they keep firing. Reinforce the door with this. It will not stop them forever, but it will buy us some time." Kate watched him as he worked, wrapping the chain around the heavy crossbar on the door. She wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to tell all of them to go, but the words just would not come out. The bell in the tower rang once, a soft, far-off sound, and then it stopped. Kate glanced toward the sound, then looked back to the window. The town was starting to wake up, slowly, and with no real desire to. A new sound of boots crunched on the porch. The door opened and Wyatt Kane stepped inside, followed by 2 men in dark coats. They had the look of Pinkertons about them. Kane took off his hat, letting the snow fall from the brim. "Miss Landry," he said, "Wyatt Kane, with the Pinkerton Agency. We have been on the trail of Butcher Roar for months. We got word about what happened with his brother." Kate stood up straight, and Kane motioned to the men behind him. "I have got 30 agents scattered in these hills. We can turn this whole town into a trap. We can draw him in, cut off his escape, and we can finish him right here." Kate looked at him closely. "You want to use Eagle's Crossing as bait?" "I want to put an end to a man who has burned down towns and left no one alive to talk about it," Kane said, his voice steady. "Your school is the one lure he just cannot resist." Kate looked out the window again. The ridge was still empty, but the quiet felt heavier now. "Your positions are all wrong," she finally said. Kane raised an eyebrow. "Butcher will not come straight up the valley," she went on. "He will split his men, sending some northwest through the old mines and some southeast along the Cedar Break. He will want to take the high ground first. Set up a crossfire. Your men are too out in the open on the main slopes." Kane studied her for a long, hard moment. Then he nodded. "We will make the changes." He turned to his men. "Get the word out to the others. Follow her corrections." They left. Cody Blaine showed up at the door next, looking small but determined and holding a folded telegraph form. "I can take another wire if you need me to," he said. "I am fast." Kate knelt down to his level. "You have already done more than enough, Cody." The boy just shook his head. "I want to help, just like you do." She put a hand on his shoulder. "You already are." He gave a small, proud smile and then ran off into the snow. Kate stood up, her hand going to the locket she wore around her neck. She opened it, and her thumb brushed against the cool metal inside. It was a gift from Colonel Boone after her last performance. His words came back to her, as soft as a memory. There has got to be more to this life than just entertaining crowds. She had believed him then, and now the price of that belief was riding north on horseback. Nora came to stand next to her. "You okay?" Kate snapped the locket shut. "No, but I am here." Outside, the wind had finally died down. The town lay perfectly still under the gray sky. Then she saw a faint smudge on the northern horizon. It was too far to tell if it was dust or smoke. Kate raised the Remington and pressed her eye against the scope. The smudge turned into movement. Riders, a thin, dark line moving against the white snow. Wyatt Kane stepped back inside, his voice low. "My scouts confirm it. It is Butcher. He is on the move. 60 men, maybe even more." Kate lowered the rifle slowly. "They are here," she said. The words came out quiet, but they carried the heavy weight of something that could not be taken back. Inside her chest, something settled into place. It was a cold, certain feeling. There would be no more running, no more pretending she could keep this all to herself. The school would open tomorrow. The children would come, and if Butcher Roar wanted to burn it to the ground, he would have to go through her first. She turned away from the window, her hand tightening its grip on the Remington. The bell rang again, one slow, sad toll. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of hooves began to ride in on the wind. Dawn was just a thief, creeping over the ridge, gray and unwilling to show its face, turning the snow to a dull silver color. Eagle's Crossing lay quiet underneath it. The streets were empty, and the rooftops were heavy with frost. Not a single bird was singing, and no smoke was yet curling from the chimneys. The air smelled of frozen dirt and pine trees, sharp with the feeling that more snow was on its way. Inside the schoolhouse, the stove popped softly. The little warmth it offered was barely enough to fight off the cold that seeped right through the walls. Kate Landry climbed the narrow stairs that led to the bell tower. The Remington rifle was slung over her shoulder, and every single step creaked loudly under her boots. The tower was small, with just enough room for the bell and a low bench, but it gave her the high ground. It gave her clear lines of sight. Over the main street, the ridge to the north, and the cedar breaks down to the southeast. She settled in against the wall, her knees pulled up, and pressed her eye to the scope. The lens gathered up the dim light, making the world outside sharp and focused. She could see Cole Ramsey's silhouette on the roof of his store, his lantern held low as he signaled that he was ready. She saw Buck Tanner's hunched form up in the loft of the livery stable, his rifle barrel glinting just a little. Wyatt Kane had moved his Pinkertons during the night, shifting them around just like she had told him. 10 men to the mining trails, 15 to the breaks, and the rest scattered all over the hills. "You know him better than we do," Kane had told her before he left. Kate did not bother to correct him. She did not know Butcher Roar, the man, but she knew the type, arrogant and predictable in his cruelty. Her hands trembled as she loaded the Remington, her thumb pressing the cartridges home with a soft little click. She paused, staring down at her fingers. They were not supposed to shake, not her hands, but the weight of the night was pressing in. The children who would be knocking on the door soon, expecting their lessons, and the town that had trusted her to keep the bulbs. The school bell was set to ring, but her whole life, the one she'd carefully built here, felt like it could be wiped away as easy as chalk on a slate. A part of her wanted to run, to throw her things in the trunk, get on a horse and just ride east. She could go back to the shows, the big crowds, and the empty feeling of folks clapping. But that idea just sat heavy in her stomach, like a bad meal. It wasn't just a teacher these children would be losing. They'd be losing their last bit of hope. She knew right then she could not leave. Not this time. She saw a little flash up on the ridge. 2 riders, just dark shapes against the snow, moving slow along the edge of the trees. They were scouts. Kate picked up her Remington rifle and set it firm on the windowsill. Her warm breath made a little fog on the cold scope, and she wiped it clean. The rider in the lead stopped and started looking over the town with a pair of binoculars. She let out a long, slow breath, her finger finding the trigger. The sound of the shot bounced all across the valley. The lead rider's horse jumped up, empty, and took off running back the way it came. The second scout turned his horse sharp and disappeared back into the woods. Kate put the rifle down, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't aimed to kill, just to send a message. But her hands were shaking something fierce now. Down below, the town was starting to wake up. Doors creaked open, and you could hear folks whispering on the wind. Then from the north, a lone rider came down Main Street. He had a white cloth tied to the barrel of his rifle. He rode real slow and deliberate, the sound of his horse's hooves quiet in the fresh snow. Even from a ways off, you could see he favored Rafe. He had the same wide shoulders, a scarred-up face, and eyes that looked like bits of cold, hard rock. It was Butcher Roar. Kate came down the stairs in a hurry, still holding that Remington. Nora was waiting for her at the bottom, her doctor's bag in hand. "He's here," was all Kate had to say. Nora just gave a nod. "I'll keep an eye on the back." Butcher pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of the street, about 20 paces from the schoolhouse steps. When the wind changed, you could smell the horse sweat and gun oil on him. He opened his arms wide, that white cloth flopping around. "Come on out, Swift Kate," he hollered, his voice sounding almost friendly, and loud enough to stir the whole town. "Let's you and I have a talk like civilized people before this all gets ugly. My brother, he made a bad move. I'm sure we can figure something out." Kate stepped out onto the porch. She kept the Remington pointed down, but she was ready. The blood was pounding in her ears. Butcher just smiled. "Well, there you are. Still love an audience, don't you?" He leaned over in his saddle. "Give up now. Ride out of town with your life. We'll just call it square." Kate didn't say a word. She just raised that Remington, took a quick aim, and fired. The bullet snatched his hat right off his head, sending it tumbling into the snow. Butcher's horse sidestepped, but the man himself did not even flinch. His laugh was a cold sound that cut right through the air. "You still got the knack," he said. "But can you see every direction at once? I got men all around this place. They'll turn it to ash if I say the word. And all 'cause you couldn't just let a little protection money slide." Kate looked him square in the eye. "This ain't about money. This is about fellas like you who think making folks scared gives you the right to own them. This school belongs to these children, and this town belongs to its people." Butcher's smile vanished. People. "All I see is a bunch of yellow bellies hiding behind their doors while you play the hero. How many good folks are you willing to let die for what you believe in?" A light blinked from the roof of Cole's store. It was a quick puff of smoke from a covered lantern. Butcher's men were moving, fanning out to circle the town. Kate's voice was as steady as a rock. "This is your last chance. Ride out now." So Butcher turned his horse to leave. "Have it your way, teacher lady. Their blood is on your hands." He kicked his horse into a gallop, and the white cloth fell into the snow like a broken promise. And then, from the ridges, the first shots started to crackle, coming one after another from all around. Kate rushed back inside and ran up the stairs to the tower. She was breathing hard now. That Remington felt like it weighed a ton. Nora's voice came from downstairs. "They're coming." Kate looked to the north. She saw a man with a big buffalo gun getting set up on the ridge, pointing it right at the school. She breathed out, squeezing the trigger slow and easy. The shot rang true. The man grabbed his arm with a jerk, and his big gun fell down into the snow. Kate lowered her rifle, her heart pounding like a drum at a powwow. "It started," she whispered. The valley was filled with the sound of gunfire now, and the air was getting thick with the sharp smell of gun smoke. She loaded another bullet, her eyes gone cold and hard. But way down deep inside, a knot of fear was pulling tight. There was no going back now. The first real volley came at dawn, the crack of rifles shattering the quiet, the sound chasing itself up and down the ridge like a big clap of thunder. Smoke started rising from the cedar trees and the old mining trails. Little black lines twisting up into the cold morning air. Eagle's Crossing had a new smell to it now. That bitter scent of gunpowder, the smell of wet dirt kicked up by horses, and the faint metallic smell of blood that had already been spilled. Butcher Roar's voice echoed up from the street, raw and full of command. "Hit 'em from every side. Burn that school down first." Kate Landry leaned hard against the wall of the bell tower. She held the Remington steady on the sill, her breath misting up the scope. The first few shots had been scattered, just testing the waters, but now they were coming in a steady rhythm. They were coming from the north ridge, the southeast woods, and the alley by the livery. Her heart was beating so hard against her ribs she thought it might break through. Every single beat was a reminder that this was not some show. There would not be any applause when this was over. She found the man on the ridge again in her sights. The one with that buffalo gun, its barrel as thick as a man's arm, pointed right at the front doors of her school. Her finger found the trigger, paused for just a second, and then she squeezed. The rifle cracked, splitting the air. The man yelped and grabbed his arm. That heavy gun of his just tumbled down into the snow. His partners scattered like a spooked herd of cattle, their whole plan falling apart in the confusion. Kate lowered the rifle, her hand shaking just a little bit on the wooden stock. The blood was rushing in her ears. She'd aimed for his arm, not his chest. But the thought of taking a life to save others was twisting her insides up like a length of barbed wire. "Movement on the south side," Miss Nora's voice came up, through the speaking tube, which was just a piece of stovepipe they'd run down to the main room. "2 men. They got torches, and they're heading for the back." Kate moved like lightning, taking the stairs 3 at a time, her boots making a thudding sound on the floorboards. The school suddenly felt a whole lot smaller, like the walls were closing in with every gunshot from outside. She got to the back window and kneeled down low behind a wall of stacked-up desks and took aim again. There was a man sneaking down the alley holding a glass bottle with a rag sticking out of it. It was a kerosene bomb. His friend was covering him, rifle ready. Kate let her breath out slow. The rifle shot rang out. The bottle exploded in his hand. Kerosene went everywhere but did no harm. The man hollered and fell into the snow. The flames just sputtered and died in the wet. His partner fired off a wild shot. The bullet chewed up the window frame right above her head. Little slivers of wood stung her cheek. She could taste blood where one of them had cut her. She rolled away, her heart just pounding. "This is not a show," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. "This is not." The memories just came rushing back without her asking. Big crowds in Denver cheering as she split playing cards from 100 yards away with a blindfold on. The excitement of it all hiding how empty she felt. But here, every time she pulled that trigger, it cost something real. It cost lives, and innocence, and the delicate little bit of hope she had managed to build in this very room. Out in the hills, Wyatt Kane's Pinkerton men started answering back. Their shots were sharp and disciplined, cutting off one of the attacks. But Kate was the one in the middle, the one everyone was counting on. She climbed over to a side window, then slid out onto the low overhang of the roof, crawling on her belly to the edge. From this spot, she could see the main attack, Riders were charging down the street, their guns blazing at every window and door. She fired 2 times. The first shot grazed a horse's side, making it buck and throw its rider. The second shot knocked a torch right out of another man's hand. The attackers pulled up, yelling and confused. "Where is she shooting from? It's like they got more than one ghost in these walls." Butcher's roar cut through all the noise. "Burn it down! Burn that dang school to the ground!" Kate felt her throat get tight. The children. She could see all 28 of their faces, all of them trusting her to open the school door for them tomorrow. If this school burned down, what would happen then? There would be no more lessons written on slates, no more stories to take them to places beyond this ridge. She aimed at a man lighting a new bomb right near the porch steps. Her finger shook on the trigger, paused again for a heartbeat, and then she squeezed. The bottle blew up in the air and the glass rained down. With no harm done, the man fell down, cussing, as fire licked at his sleeve before he could roll around in the snow to put it out. She slipped back inside, breathing hard, and wiped the sweat from her eyes, even though it was cold. The speaking tube hissed again. "East Side is breaking. The Pinkertons are holding them," Nora called out. "Good," Kate muttered back. But her voice was trembling. She looked down the stairs. Little Cody Blaine was huddled in the corner, his eyes as wide as dinner plates, with his hands clamped over his ears to block out the thunder of the guns. He should not be seeing this. None of these children should. Butcher's voice boomed out again. "That's enough. Split up. I want you to search every single house, every barn. You find her." Kate went cold all over. The sound of the shooting changed. It was not as organized now. Riders were getting off their horses, kicking in doors all up and down the street. The smoke got thicker, and it carried the smell of wood burning from somewhere to the east. She went down the stairs fast, her legs feeling shaky, a little trickle of blood running down from the cut on her cheek. The main room felt wide open and unsafe now, and the blackboard was full of new holes that looked like they were mocking her. She stopped and just stared at it. Yesterday's arithmetic was still written there in chalk, but half of it was wiped out by bullets. "They're hunting us," she whispered, talking more to herself than to Nora, "like a pack of rabid dogs." That fear was a cold stone in her belly, as bitter as the snow swirling outside. If she couldn't stop them, the schoolhouse would go up in flames. Everything she had poured her heart into, the lessons, the hope, it would all turn to dust and ash. Nora put a hand on her arm. "Kate." But Kate just shook her head, her knuckles white on the Remington stock. The hunt had started. They were chasing a ghost in the smoke. The morning sun struggled to climb, but its light did nothing to pierce the thick haze that blanketed Eagle's Crossing like a funeral shroud. Smoke from the rifles hung heavy in the air, drifting in gray sheets that made your eyes water and your throat raw. It was a nasty, bitter smell, mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder, and the faint, almost sweet scent of burning sage from the fires on the ridge. A dusting of snow was still on the ground, but it was all chewed up now, turned to a nasty stew of mud and blood from the boots and hooves. The valley rang with the sharp crack of rifles here and there. Men hollered, their words swallowed by the fog, and every so often a horse would scream in pain. Kate Landry slid out the back door of the schoolhouse. She held that Remington tight, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs like a trapped quail. She kept low, moving down the alley, her boots sinking in the cold slush, each breath a small, sharp pull of air. The cut on her cheek was throbbing something fierce, and the blood was drying sticky on her skin. She stopped at the corner, just listening. Butcher's men were all spread out now, kicking in doors down Main Street, their voices rough and full of aggravation. "Where in the blazes is she? Somebody check the stable. It has got to be more than just one person shooting." Kate shut her eyes for a second, fighting back a wave of worry that washed over her. What kind of lesson was she teaching these children? That shooting your way out of trouble was the only answer? That a rifle was the right tool to mend what fear had torn apart? But then she saw Cody's big, trusting eyes, and she pictured the empty desks in the morning if she gave up. She shoved that doubt down deep and made her legs move. She darted across the way to the livery stable and slipped in through the side door. The air inside was heavy with the smell of hay and horse, a welcome warmth against the outside chill. Buck Tanner was hunkered down by the loft window, his rifle barrel resting easy on the sill. He gave her a single nod as she climbed the ladder. "The east flank is holding," he said in a low grumble. "The Pinkertons cut him off." Kate got settled right beside him, bringing her own Remington up. Through the scope, she saw a little bunch of them, 3 men trying to creep toward the general store with their rifles held low. She centered the crosshairs on the man in the lead, let out a slow breath, and felt her finger tremble. Buddies scattered, yelling in a panic. She was not dead, just out of the fight. His buddies scattered, yelling in a panic. She is everywhere. It is a ghost. Buck fired next, and he winged another one who tried to circle around. "Good shot," he said, his voice all gravel. Kate did not say a word. Her hands were shaking as she chambered another round. All those old tricks from her sharpshooting shows came flooding back without her even trying, like hitting targets blindfolded under the bright stage lights while the crowds gasped. But this was not some show. This was real blood staining the snow. She slid down from the loft, crossed the alley again, moving fast and low, then pulled herself up onto the short roof of Ramsey's store. The shingles were slick with a layer of frost. She almost went down, her fingernails scraping against the wood. Cole Ramsey was lying flat at the edge of the roof, a spyglass in his hand. "West side," he whispered, not even turning to look at her. 4 men, and they got torches ready." Kate crawled up next to him, pushing the Remington forward. The smoke was even thicker up here, making her eyes burn and water. She wiped them clean and peered through the haze. The group was moving on the school now, bottles in their hands. She could see the kerosene sloshing inside the glass, with rags stuffed in the tops for wicks. Butcher's voice roared from somewhere inside that fog. "Light them up! Burn her out of there!" Kate felt the air leave her lungs. The school, her school, with its alphabet charts on the walls and the scattered reading primers on the desks, about to go up in smoke. She saw the children's faces flash in her mind. Cody's proud grin when he spelled a word right. The shy little ones who finally started to open up with a few gentle words. If it all burned, what would be left for them? She aimed for the first bottle, her finger tightening. The rifle cracked, and the glass exploded in mid-air. Kerosene flew everywhere, catching fire for a second before it fizzled out harmlessly on the snow. The man who was holding it dropped down, cussing a blue streak, flames licking at his coat before he could roll around and put them out. The others started firing wild, bullets whining right past the roof. Cole ducked down. Kate flattened herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They're turning!" Cole hissed. "They're heading for the church now!" Kate pushed herself up to one knee and fired again, hitting another man in the leg and sending him down screaming. She was not trying to kill them, just to wound them enough to break their nerve. But every time she pulled the trigger, it carved out a piece of her, leaving her feeling hollow, her eyes red and burning from something more than just the smoke. She dropped off the roof, landing hard in the slush, the shock jarring her knees. Taking ragged breaths, she ran back toward the school, slipping once on a patch of ice and scraping her palm raw. Nora met her at the door, her face as pale as a sheet, with her medical bag wide open on the floor. "We got 2 wounded of our own coming in," she said, "and one of theirs. I just cannot turn him away." Kate just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Do what you can." Nora went to work fast, bandaging a Pinkerton's grazed arm. Then she turned to the captured man from Rohr's crew. He was just a boy, his young face all twisted up in pain from the bleeding leg Kate had shot. He glared up at her. "You are the devil himself," he spat out. Kate had to look away, her hand going to the locket she wore around her neck. She opened it, her thumb brushing against the cool metal of Colonel Boone's medal. His words came back to her. There has to be more than splitting cards for applause. She had believed him then, but this right here, the blood, the screams, what kind of price was too high? "You were right," she whispered to the memory. "But this costs way too much." Roosevelt burst in through the back door, all out of breath. "The North Trail. They are trying to push through again. Buck is holding them, but he needs some cover." Kate nodded and grabbed a fresh handful of cartridges from the desk. "Tell him I am on my way." Wyatt Kane's voice came through on a makeshift signal. 3 flashes of light from the hill. "We have cut off their retreat. They are all bunching up." Kate slipped back outside, this time making her way to the livery roof. It was higher up and a lot more dangerous. From that spot she saw another group, 5 men, trying to get organized near the saloon. Their torches were lit again. Butcher's voice hollered from the street, "Fire them! Burn every last thing to the ground!" She fired once, then twice, shattering bottles, and men fell with wounds in their arms and legs. The screaming started up again. Confusion was spreading through their ranks. "She is a ghost. We cannot pin her down. There are more shooters. There has got to be." Buck was firing from down below. Rosa was calling out their movements from the ground. The whole town was fighting now. It was not just her anymore. But Kate's arms ached something awful. Her eyes were on fire. She reloaded with hands that would not stop shaking, her breath catching in her throat like she was about to cry. Then, from down on the street, came Butcher's terrible roar. "Enough of this nonsense!" Kate peered down over the edge. He was pulling something out of his saddlebag. It was a rolled-up map. The edges were all frayed. A cold dread washed over her. "You prepared pretty well, Swift Kate," he bellowed. "But did you prepare for this?" He was pointing at the old mine tunnels that ran right underneath the whole town. He let out a laugh that was cruel and loud. "The charges are all set. You surrender, or I will drop every single building right down around your ears." Nora's voice came through the speaking tube from the school, sounding faint. "Kate, they are going down into the shafts with dynamite." Kate froze right there on the roof, the wind whipping smoke across her face. The Remington suddenly felt useless in her hands. Bullets were not going to be enough to stop what was coming up from below. The flood was coming. The midday sun was just a weak glow through the smoke which turned the sky the color of old, worn pewter. Eagle's Crossing had turned into a real battlefield, all drifting haze and the sharp echoes of noise. The crack of rifles, men yelling, and the low groan of wood splintering as stray bullets found their mark. The snow was a gray slush, streaked with blood and black powder. The air had a thick taste to it. Sulfur, damp earth, and the burning wool from a coat somebody had set on fire in all the panic. Kate Landry was hunkered down on the livery roof. The Remington was hot against her shoulder, and she was taking small, shallow breaths. Her hands were aching from the constant recoil. The cut on her cheek had opened up again, and a warm trickle of blood was running down her jaw. Down below, Butcher Roar was standing right in the middle of Main Street. He had a map unrolled in his gloved hands, and his voice carried over all the noise, sounding raw and full of victory. "The charges are set. Do you hear me, Swift Kate? This whole town is going to drop into the earth, school and all, unless you surrender right now." Kate's stomach twisted itself into a knot. The old mine tunnels, sealed up since the big flood of '65, ran right under half the buildings, and that included the school. If those charges went off, the ground itself would just swallow up everything she had been fighting to protect. The desks, the books, the quiet hope of children learning to read and write. She pressed her eye to the scope, looking for any sign of movement near the mouths of the old shafts. Shadows were shifting in the haze, and she could see men disappearing into the dark openings of the tunnels, their packs heavy with sticks of dynamite. Nora's voice crackled through the speaking tube that ran from the school. "Kate, they are inside. Coal is ready. Just give the word." Kate's throat felt like it was closing up. She touched the locket at her neck, the colonel's metal cold against her skin. His words echoed in her head. There has to be more to life than splitting cards for crowds. She had believed him with all her heart, but now the cost of that belief was staring her right in the face. If those tunnels collapsed, the school was gone for good. There would be no more mornings filled with chalk dust and the sound of small voices. There would be no more future for Cody Blaine and all the other children. Tears stung her eyes, hot and sudden. She blinked them back, angry with herself. Crying was not going to save a single thing. She keyed the tube. Now, Cole. A low boom rolled through the ground under her feet. It was not the sharp crack of dynamite, but something deeper, something wetter. Water shot out of the mouths of the shafts like giant geysers, sending a freezing spray high up into the air. The flood of '65 had left huge underground pockets of water. Cole had found the old maps, and he knew exactly where the weakest walls were. He had set his own traps, little ones but mighty precise, to bust through the barricades. Black water came roaring through the tunnels, knocking men clean off their feet, snuffing out fuses and ruining all the good powder. You could hear 'em yelling. Horses went wild as butchers' men were washed out like drowned rats, coming up soaked and sputtering, their explosives all wet and worthless. Kate took aim from a rooftop, picking off the ones trying to claw their way up the banks. She aimed for shoulders and thighs, just enough to push them back in the water, not to kill. She never could stomach a kill, but every shot left her shaking a little more, her breath catching like a sob she refused to let loose. Butcher roared with pure fury, his face all twisted up. "Kill every last one! Burn it all down! Shoot anything that moves!" His men, their spirits broken, they hesitated. A few fired off shots into the air. Others just turned tail and ran for the ridge. That's when the Pinkertons and the townsfolk started closing in. Buck Tanner from the livery stable, Rose Avail directing folks from an alley. Wyatt Kane's agents were blocking off all the escape roads. The tide was surely turning, but it wasn't a clean victory. Men were still bleeding out in the snow. Horses were still screaming. Thick smoke made it hard to breathe. Kate slid right down from the roof, her boots landing in the slush. She started running toward the school, her legs feeling heavy as lead, her lungs on fire. Nora met her right at the door, pulling her inside just long enough to press a clean piece of cloth to the cut on her cheek. "You're bleeding again," Nora said, her voice pulled tight as a fiddle string. Kate winced a bit as Nora tied the bandage. "Got to be quick." Nora's hands were shaking too. "This ain't over yet." Kate looked her right in the eye. "I know." She stepped back out onto the street. She brought the Remington up. The fighting had died down some. Butcher's crew was broken and scattered all over, but he was still sitting on his horse in the middle of Main Street, his face beat red with rage. He saw her come out of the school and dug his spurs in. The horse kicked up a spray of mud and snow. "You and those little brats will die together," he hollered, pulling out his revolver. Kate planted her boots firm in the middle of that street, bringing the Remington up slow and deliberate. Her hands were trembling. From being tired, from being scared, from the weight of everything she had already done. But she steadied them, aimed square at his chest, then lowered the barrel just a hair. Her voice came out quiet and cracked. "No, not today." Butcher let out a harsh, broken laugh and leveled his own gun. The whole street fell strangely quiet between them. The smoke just drifting slow, the distant crackle of dying fires was the only sound you could hear. Kate's finger curled around the trigger. No more running. No more hiding behind a blackboard. This thing was going to end right here, face to face. The street was wide open under a sky all choked up with smoke. The midday sun was just a dull bronze coin behind all that haze. Eagles Crossing smelled like spent gunpowder, blood-soaked snow, and the sour smell of burning hair from some fella's coat that caught fire earlier. Hooves had turned the slush into a reddish-brown mud. Far-off shouts and the crackle of fires burning out filled the silence between the gunshots. Butcher Roar spurred his horse right down the middle of Main Street, his coat flapping behind him, his face twisted up in a mask of pure rage. He was riding straight for the schoolhouse, his revolver already in his hand. Kate Landry stepped off the porch and into the open road. She held the Remington low in both hands. Her coat was torn up at the sleeve. The blood from the cut on her cheek had dried in dark lines down her face. Her legs felt heavy, like the ground itself was trying to pull her under. She had run out of places to hide. No more rooftops, no more shadows. There was just this stretch of frozen dirt between her and the man who came here to wipe out everything she had built. Butcher pulled his horse up hard, the animal snorting big clouds of steam. He stared down at her, breathing all ragged, his eyes looking wild. "You and them brats are gonna die together." He roared it out, raising his revolver. Kate lifted the Remington slow and steady, not aiming just yet, just holding it. Her arms were shaking from being so tired. Her eyes burned from the smoke and the tears she wouldn't let fall. She could feel the children behind the schoolhouse windows, 28 small faces, all counting on her to keep that door open for them tomorrow. If she failed right now, there wouldn't be a tomorrow. No more chalk dust, no more little voices sounding out their letters. The thought squeezed her chest so tight she could hardly get a breath. Butcher laughed, a mean, busted sound. Still the show-off, always from a distance. "Come on now, Swift Kate. Face me like a real woman down here. No scope, no fancy tricks." Kate's throat felt tight. She remembered Colonel Boone's voice, soft and low after her last performance. There's got to be more to life than just entertaining crowds. She had believed him. She had come all this way to teach, to build something that would last. Now that belief was all that stood between her and a bullet, and it felt like the most fragile thing in the whole world. She spoke quietly, her voice hoarse from all the shouting and the smoke. "This is not about being brave. It is about protecting what matters." Butcher's lip curled up. What matters? A schoolhouse full of snot-nosed kids and a teacher who thinks she is some kind of legend. He jerked his revolver toward the school window where Nora's shadow had just appeared, watching them. "Watch this!" He fired. Glass exploded inward. Nora ducked down. Shards of glass rained all over the floor inside. Kate's finger tightened on the trigger before she even had a chance to think. The Remington cracked once, a sharp, clean sound. Butcher's revolver flew from his hand, clattering down into the snow. He cursed, clutching his wrist, blood already swelling up between his fingers. He rolled off his horse, hitting the ground with a thud, and scrambled for the gun he'd dropped. Kate fired again, lower this time. The bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through cloth and flesh. He staggered back, empty-handed, his breath hissing through clenched teeth. Kate stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The Remington was still raised, her hand shaking something awful now, her vision getting blurry at the edges. She could end it all right here, one more shot, clean and done. But she lowered the barrel just an inch. "I want you alive," she said, her voice cracking. "To face up to what you have done. To answer for the towns you burned. For the lives you took." Butcher knelt in the mud, blood dripping from his shoulder, staining the snow dark red. He looked up at her, his face pale. But that sneer was still there, twisted and defiant. "You think you have won?" he rasped. "You think this ends with me? There will be others just like me. There always will be. You cannot shoot all of them." Kate just stared down at him. Behind her, the school was still standing, scarred with bullet holes, windows all busted, but it was still upright. It was still hers. She whispered almost to herself. Maybe, but not today. Wyatt Kane walked out of the smoke, his coat torn, his revolver back in its holster. 2 Pinkertons flanked him, their rifles at the ready. The townsfolk started stepping out slow. Buck Tanner from the livery, Rose of Vale from the alley. Cole Ramsey came down from his roof, closing the circle. Kane walked up to Butcher, cuffs in his hand. "Butcher roar," Kane said, all formal. "By the authority of the Pinkerton Agency and the United States government, you are under arrest. Murder, extortion, arson. Too many charges to list." Butcher laughed again, a weak, bitter sound, as Kane knelt down to put the cuffs on him. "You will see, this is not the end." Kate did not move. She just stood there in the middle of the street, the Remington hanging loose at her side, its barrels still warm. Smoke drifted past her face. The wind carried the distant crackle of fires as they finally died out. Her eyes were red-rimmed and looked far away. She looked back at the school, its walls pockmarked, its windows shattered, but the door was still standing open. The children were safe inside, at least for now. Wyatt Kane stood up, Butcher secured between his men. He glanced over at Kate. "It is over," he said quietly. Kate did not answer. She lowered the rifle all the way, its barrel pointing down at the snow. The street fell silent. There was only the wind, the soft drip of melting ice from the eaves, and the faint groan of a wounded horse somewhere down the block. She stood there, not moving a muscle as they led Butcher away. The fight was over, but the weight of what she had done, of what she had become, settled on her shoulders like the first heavy flakes of the next snowstorm. The aftermath was settling in. The sun was hanging low in the west, bleeding orange light through the thinning smoke. Eagles Crossing was quiet now. It was the kind of quiet that always follows violence, feeling all hollow and heavy, broken only by the soft crunch of boots in the snow, and every now and then the groan of someone hurt too bad to stay quiet. The wind had died down. The air smelled of wet ash, blood-soaked wool, and that faint coppery tang that hangs around after gunpowder burns off. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the fight, leaving the streets marked with dark stains and the bodies of men who would not be getting up again. Nora Hale knelt in the school doorway, her medical bag open at her feet. Her hands moved with a calm she'd practiced 1,000 times, tying off a bandage on a Pinkerton's grazed forearm, then turning to one of Roar's men who was lying pale against the wall, his legs shattered by a stray shot. She did not ask for names. She just did her work. Kate Landry sat on the top step of the porch. The Remington was laid across her knees, its barrel cooling in the chill air. The blood from her cheek had dried in a thin black line. Her coat sleeve was torn, and her fingers were still trembling just a little when she tried to hold them still. Nora glanced up. "You are next." Kate just shook her head. "Later." Nora did not argue with her. She finished the bandage, wiped her hands on her apron, and came to sit down next to Kate. For a long moment, neither one of them said a word. The town moved around them like it was in slow motion. Leah Wren walked the street with a notebook, sketching the damaged roofs and broken windows. Doc Graves directed 2 men who were carrying a body wrapped in canvas over toward the undertaker's shed. Cole Ramsey was sweeping broken glass from his store porch, his face looking grim. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Wyatt Kane stopped at the bottom of the steps, holding his hat in his hand. His coat was torn at the shoulder. There was blood on the cuff, but it was not his. "Butcher is in irons," he said quietly. "The rest of his men, the ones still breathing, are rounded up. Federal marshals are coming to take them at first light. Their trial will be in Denver. He will not see the open sky again." Kate just nodded once. Those words should have brought her some relief. They did not. Sheriff Jack Harland came next, his boots heavy on the steps. He looked older than he had just that morning. The lines around his eyes cut deeper, his shoulders slumped. "The town is still standing," he said, "thanks to you." He paused, his eyes drifting to the bullet-riddled blackboard you could see through the open door. "But folks are asking what is going to happen now. The school board is set to meet tomorrow. Some of them want to shut it down. They think we should send the children to the next county until all this trouble blows over." Kate's hand gripped the Remington rifle tighter. "It is staying open." Heron looked at her closely. "Are you certain? After what happened today?" Kate took a moment to answer. She gazed past him at the street, which was empty now except for the slow process of cleaning up. And she felt the heavy weight of it all settle in deeper. The children were safe inside, all gathered in the back room with a handful of mothers. She could make out their quiet voices, an occasional sob that was quickly quieted. Nora gently touched her on the shoulder. "When all of this is done," she asked in a soft voice, "will we still have our teacher?" Kate had to swallow hard. Her throat felt completely raw. She opened the locket that hung around her neck, her thumb brushing over Colonel Boone's image inside. His quiet voice came back to her from after her last performance. "There has got to be more to this life than just entertaining crowds of people." She had taken his words to heart. She had come all the way here to teach, to build something that was real and lasting. Now she could not help but wonder if she had just destroyed the very woman he had pushed her to become. "I do not know," she whispered. "I do not know if I am still the person he told me I should be." Just then, Cody Blaine showed up at the door, looking small and pale, with eyes that were red from either crying or the smoke, or maybe both. He stood there on the threshold for a second. Then he ran right up and wrapped his arms tight around Kate's waist. She went stiff for a moment, worried that her blood-stained coat might scare him, worried that the smell of gunpowder on her hands would somehow leave a mark on him, but he just held on even tighter. She carefully set the rifle down and put her arms around the boy. Her hands were shaking against his small back. "Are you okay?" he mumbled into the fabric of her coat. Kate squeezed her eyes shut. "I am here." Cody pulled away a little, looking up into her face. "You will not leave the school, will you? You will not just go away." Kate's chest felt tight with a painful ache. She slowly shook her head. "No," she said. "I will not leave." But her eyes seemed far away, filled with sadness, as if a piece of her had already traveled to some other place. The street went quiet once more. The last of the smoke was drifting up into the air in thin trails. A horse made a snorting sound somewhere down the block. Doc Graves's low voice could be heard giving instructions about the men who had died. Then came the sound of hooves on the frozen dirt road. A carriage rolled into sight, a private one, very well kept, and it was escorted by two men on horseback wearing dark coats. It came to a stop right at the edge of town. A woman stepped out. She wore an elegant coat. Her hat was pinned perfectly in place, and her eyes were sharp as she surveyed the destruction. The shattered windows, the blood staining the snow, and the schoolhouse still standing defiantly in the middle of all the ruin. Clara Voss, the state education commissioner. She began to walk forward at a slow pace, her boots making a crunching sound in the snow. Her eyes finally landed on Kate on the rifle that was sitting beside her, the streak of blood on her cheek, and the sheer exhaustion that was etched onto her face. "I heard stories about Swift Kate," she said, and her voice carried clearly in the quiet air. "And about a town that decided to stand up for itself." Kate met her gaze. A flicker of recognition passed between them. It was an opportunity for sure, but it was also a heavy burden. The school had made it through. The children were all safe. But the legend was not a secret anymore. It was out in the open now, like a signal for every other town that was facing a threat. For every child who needed to learn more than just their letters. Kate got to her feet slowly. The Remington rifle was left sitting on the step. The commissioner stopped just a few feet away. "I would like to have a word with you," Clara said, "about what is going to happen next." Kate looked back at the schoolhouse. Its door was still open, and a warm light was spilling out into the growing twilight. Then she turned her eyes back to Clara Voss. She did not give an answer right away. The wind began to pick up again, bringing with it the faint smell of pine trees and distant smoke. Whatever was coming next, it was not going to be quiet. A delicate new beginning. 3 months had gone by, and spring had arrived early in Eagle's Crossing, melting the last of the stubborn snow into little streams that ran like black ink along the muddy streets. The pine trees on the ridge were showing tips of new green. The air smelled clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and budding cottonwood trees instead of gunpowder. The town had finally started to breathe easy again. The sound of hammers echoed from porches that were being rebuilt. The voices of children could be heard drifting out of open windows, and the doors to the saloon swung with a quiet sense of purpose instead of fear. The schoolhouse stood fully repaired. There were fresh wooden boards on the walls, new panes of glass in the windows, and the blackboard had been scrubbed clean of bullet marks, though some faint indentations remained, like old scars that just would not fade completely. Inside, a fire burned low in the stove, keeping the room warm against the morning chill that still lingered in the air. Kate Landry stood at the front of the room with a piece of chalk in her hand, patiently guiding Cody Blaine through a long division problem on his new slate. Her voice was gentle and calm, the very same tone she had used before the big fight, but her fingers would tremble whenever she pressed down too hard with the chalk, leaving a shaky line on the board. "Carry the 4, she instructed, "then subtract slowly, Cody. You have got this." Cody gave a nod with his tongue stuck between his teeth as his pencil scratched on the slate. All around them, the other children were busy working at their desks. There were 28 of them again, and not a single one was missing. They had all come back on the very first day the doors opened again, a little shy at first, but then eager, as if the building itself had proven something important to them all. Kate watched them now. She saw their small heads bent over their slates, and the sunlight catching the little bits of dust floating in the air. She wanted so badly to believe that this return to normal was real. She almost did. Wyatt Kane had shown up 2 weeks before, his coat neatly brushed, holding his hat in his hands. He stood in the doorway while the children were outside for recess, and he spoke in a low voice. "Pinkerton's is expanding," he told her. "We need people who understand more than just badges and guns. We need community protection that starts before any shooting happens. We would like you to train them. Our agents, the local watchmen, show them how you did it here." Kate had looked over at the blackboard, at the neat rows of math problems she had written out that morning. "I am a teacher," she said. "You are a whole lot more than that now," Kane had replied. "And this territory needs a whole lot more than that." She had not given him an answer then, and she still had not. Clara Voss showed up that very same week. She stepped out of her carriage with a kind of quiet grace, her eyes taking in the repaired walls, the new shelves filled with books, and the children laughing out in the schoolyard. She walked slowly through the schoolroom, touching a desk here, looking at a chart there. "Eagles Crossing is being considered for the territory's very first teachers' college," she finally said. "It needs stability, growth, and leadership." Her eyes came to rest on Kate. "You have given this town all three of those things." Kate just managed a small nod. "The town did that, not me." Clara gave a little smile. "The town had you." Outside, the changes were smaller, but they were just as real. Cole Ramsey had put a little book corner in his general store, with shelves of learning books and novels, and a sign that said, "Eagles Lending Library." Nora Hale had started teaching 2 young women how to be nurses, and their aprons were already stained from their lessons. The town just felt stronger, like it had been stitched back together by the troubles they had all shared. But you could still see the seams. Rafe Rohr had died in Denver 2 weeks after the fight. He was knifed during a card game in a saloon while he was trying to rebuild the gang his brother had lost. Kate heard the news from Harland, and at first she felt absolutely nothing. Then a dull ache started, like someone was pressing on a bruise. She stood at the window now, watching the children chase one another across the schoolyard. Their laughter was carried on the breeze, high-pitched and carefree. She touched the Remington, which was hanging on a peg behind her desk. It had not been fired since that day. She had not put it away either. Cody finished his arithmetic and looked up at her. "Miss Landry, discipline means protecting what is important, right? Just like you said." Kate turned from the window and managed a small smile. "Yes, but it also means knowing what happens when you have to protect it." She paused, her voice a little softer. "Sometimes protecting means making hard choices, choices that hurt." Cody frowned for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he could say. Kate looked back outside. The yard was so alive. Children were running and shouting, free in a way she knew she was not anymore. She had kept them safe. She had kept the school standing. But the woman who had once split playing cards on a galloping horse, who had walked away from cheering crowds to teach sums and stories, that woman felt like a ghost now. Someone she knew a long, long time ago. Nora stepped into the schoolroom, her apron dusted with flour from her work in the kitchen. She came and stood right beside Kate, both of them looking out at the same quiet street. Nora finally spoke, her voice soft. "You're awfully quiet today." Kate let out a slow breath, her mind turning over Kane's offer. Training folks to help out other towns. Nora just waited, patient. Kate's voice got lower, almost a whisper. "I do not want to be a legend anymore." Nora gently touched her arm. "You are not a legend, Kate. You are the woman who stood up when it counted." Kate managed a small, sad smile. Her hand drifted up toward the Remington rifle, her fingers just brushing the worn walnut stock. She did not take it down. She did not have to. It hung there, a silent reminder that another storm could roll in. And if it did, she would be ready. Outside, the children laughed again, their voices bright and whole. Right. Kate watched them, her eyes seeming to look at something far away, the weight of who she had become settling in deeper than any old scar. The town was alive, but she was forever changed. Seeds of change had found their way to Eagle's Crossing, with spring arriving early, coaxing new green from the pine trees on the ridge and melting the last of the stubborn snow. The stubborn snowdrifts turned into little streams that ran like black ink down the muddy streets. The whole town seemed to take a deep breath, slow and careful, like a man waking up from a long fever. You could hear hammers ringing on porches that were being rebuilt. The doors to the saloon swung open with quiet laughter now, not fear. The sound of children's voices drifted from open windows, high and free of worry. The schoolhouse stood like new again. Fresh pine boards covered up the bullet scars. New glass in the windows caught the morning sun. And the shelves were full of books sent from other towns that had heard their story. The blackboard was new, too, smooth and without a single mark. But sometimes, when no one was looking, Kate Landry would find herself tracing the faint outlines of the old holes with her fingertips. She stood at the front of the classroom now, a piece of chalk in her hand, watching Cody Blaine walk up to that board. The boy seemed to have grown an inch since winter, and his shoulders looked a little broader. He held the chalk with that same fierce focus he used to have for his primers, writing out a long division problem for everyone to see. His voice cracked once, still changing, but he pushed right on through. 4 goes into 28 7 times, he said, the chalk making a steady scratching sound. 7 times 4 is 28. Subtract and you get 0. Bring down the next digit. The rest of the children leaned forward, their eyes shining. 28 faces, and not a single one missing. They had all come back on the very first day the doors opened again, a little shy at first, but then eager, almost like the building itself had proven it could survive anything. Kate watched them from her desk, her hand moving without her thinking about it, toward the Remington rifle hanging on its peg. The rifle stayed there these days, cleaned and oiled, always close by. She did not reach for it much, but she never put it away either. The feel of its weight was a reminder she just could not shake. Cody finished his problem and stepped back. The class gave a small, proud round of applause. Kate smiled, but it felt thin, like it was stretched over something empty inside her. "Well done, Cody," she said, her voice gentle. "Remember, discipline is not about hurting people. It is about protecting what matters, even when it is the hardest thing to do." She paused for a moment. Her words carried a heaviness that she did not say out loud. Consequences. Blood on the snow. Choices that leave scars you cannot see. The children did not need to hear all that. Not yet. Outside, the schoolyard filled with happy shouts as recess began. Kate stepped out onto the porch, the cool spring air on her face. Clara Voss had shown up that morning. She arrived in the same carriage with that same calm and steady grace, walking through the schoolroom slowly, touching the desks, the charts, and the new shelves filled with books. "Eagle's Crossing has shown some remarkable growth," Clara said now, standing next to Kate on the steps. "Unity, resilience, leadership." Her gaze settled on the Remington, which you could see through the open door, and a teacher who gave them all 3 of those things. Kate looked down at her own hands, still rough from holding reins and pulling triggers, still shaking just a little when she let her mind linger on that day. "The town did that," she said. "It was not me." Clara gave a faint smile. "The town had you." Wyatt Kane walked up next, his coat brushed clean and his hat in his hand. He had come by himself this time, with no agents following behind him. "Pinkerton is offering a position," he said quietly. "Training. Not just agents, but local watchmen, folks defending their own communities. The model you built right here. Protection that starts before any shots are fired. We need to spread that. Kate's throat felt tight. The school is my priority. Kane nodded his head. We can work around that. She did not give him an answer right away. She just looked out at the schoolyard. Children were chasing each other, their laughter sounding bright against all the new green. Cole Ramsey had turned a corner of his store into a real book nook. Nora Hale was training 2 young women to be nurses, and their aprons were already getting stained from all the practice. The whole town felt like it had been stitched back together, and it was stronger because of its scars. Rafe Rohr had died down in Denver, knifed during a saloon fight while trying to get back what his brother had lost. Kate got the news from Harlan, and all she felt was a dull ache, like pressing on an old bruise. There was no satisfaction, no feeling of relief, just a quiet knowledge that violence only creates more violence, and she had been a part of that cycle. The children came back into the classroom, their faces flushed from playing. Kate followed them inside and stood at the board again. She wrote out a simple equation. Protection equals responsibility. She just let that sit there for a moment while the class got quiet. Discipline is not about force, she said gently. It is about knowing what you are willing to stand for. And sometimes standing means you have to make choices that hurt. She looked at their faces, so open and full of trust. Her hand went to the locket at her throat, her thumb brushing against Colonel Boone's medal. She had believed him once that there was more to this life than just getting applause. She still believed it. But paying that price had carved something out of her, leaving behind an emptiness she had no idea how to fill. Later on, as the sun started to get low in the sky, she stood on the porch again. Clara Voss and Wyatt Kane were talking quietly by the carriage. They were making plans for the teachers' college, for training programs, a whole blueprint for other towns to follow. Kate just watched them, her arms crossed against the evening chill. Nora came out to join her apron still dusted with flour from the kitchen. They want you to teach other people, Nora said, how to hold a gun, how to stand your ground. Kate let out a long, slow breath. I do not want to be a legend anymore. Nora laid a hand on her arm. You are not a legend, Kate. You are the woman who stood up when it mattered the most. Kate gave a small, weary smile. Her eyes drifted back to the Remington rifle hanging just inside the door. Its walnut stock was catching the last bit of daylight. She did not make a move to take it down. She did not need to. It just stayed there. A quiet promise that if the next storm came, she would be there to answer it. The sound of the children's laughter drifted over from the yard again, bright and unbroken. Kate watched them, her gaze far away. The weight of what she had become settled on her, deeper than any bullet scar could ever be. The town was alive, but she would forever carry the silence of what that life had cost. The ripple effect spread as summer settled over Eagle's Crossing like a warm blanket, heavy with the smell of sun-baked pine and wild grass. The ridge had turned a deep emerald green. The river was running clear and fast after the spring melt. The whole town did not feel like it was holding its breath anymore. Hammers were ringing steady now. There were new roofs, bigger porches, and a fresh coat of whitewash on the schoolhouse walls. The children's laughter seemed to carry farther and sound freer, as if the echoes of gunfire had finally faded away into the hills. The school had turned into something more than just a classroom. Women started arriving from the neighboring towns, some by themselves, some with little children, all of them drawn by stories that traveled faster than any telegraph wire. A former student of Kate's, now married and living 20 miles to the east, led the very first group. She stood on the porch one bright morning, holding her hat in her hand. We heard what you did, she said simply. We are tired of waiting around for someone else to protect us. Teach us how. Kate looked at all of them. She saw young faces and older ones with lines of worry etched into them, and she felt that familiar ache settle even deeper in her chest. She gave a single nod. Inside, the schoolroom slowly filled up. Rosa Vale taught them how to read a trail, how to spot fresh tracks, hidden paths, and the signs of an ambush. Laya Wren unrolled maps that she had drawn herself, with lines that were sharp and strategic. They showed the high ground, the choke points, and the fallback routes. Kate stood at the front with the Remington hanging on its peg behind her desk like a silent observer. She talked about more than just marksmanship. "A gun is just a tool," she said, her voice low and steady. "The real strength is in standing together. Discipline is not about hurting. It is about protecting what is precious and knowing the price you pay when you have to." The women listened, some of them taking notes, others just watching her face. They practiced out in the yard after the lessons, dry-firing borrowed rifles, learning how to align their sights and control their breathing. Kate would gently correct their grip or adjust their stance, but her own hands trembled whenever she touched the cold steel. It was not from fear anymore, but from memory. The dreams came back every single night. The crack of gunshots, blood on the snow, the butcher's final sneer. She would wake up sweating, her heart pounding, and would lie there staring at the ceiling until the sun came up. News came with a writer from Denver. Rafe Rohr had died in a saloon knife fight, trying to piece back together what his brother had lost. Kate heard it from Harlan while they were having coffee at Cole's bigger store. She just stared into her cup, feeling nothing at all at first. And then a dull, empty ache, like pressing on an old scar. "Good riddance," Harlan muttered under his breath. Kate did not say a word. Violence had claimed another life, and she had been a part of it all. The thought made her feel tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Pinkerton opened a regional office in the old assay building. You could see Wyatt Kane's men coming and going, training the local folks in a community watch. Clara Voss came back twice, confirming that the teachers' college would be built right here. "Your model is spreading," she said. "Towns are asking how you did it." Kate finally accepted Kane's offer. She would hold training sessions twice a week, a month. But she had conditions. The school would always be her #1 duty, no exceptions. Cody Blaine had grown into the role of her assistant teacher. He was tall now, with a deeper voice, and he helped the younger children with their math. While Kate was working with the women, he never once asked about the rifle anymore. He just accepted that it was there, just like the blackboard or the stove. One evening, long after the women had all gone home, Kate stood all by herself in the classroom. The sunlight was slanting through the windows, making the dust particles in the air look like gold. She reached up and touched the locket at her throat, the metal with Colonel Boone's image feeling cool against her skin. She opened it, her thumb brushing over the engraving. "I followed your advice," she whispered to it. "But you never told me what the price would be." The words just hung there in the quiet room. A new group of women arrived the very next day. They were from a town farther to the west, and their faces were worn with a mixture of fear and determination. They stood together in the yard, with their hats shading their eyes from the sun. "How do we protect ourselves the way you all did?" one of them asked. Kate looked at them, and then her gaze drifted past them to the children playing in the schoolyard, chasing each other, laughing, completely free in a way she no longer remembered how to be. She could feel the weight of the Remington behind her, the locket against her chest, and the eyes of every single woman waiting for her to give them an answer. "You start by refusing to be afraid," she told them quietly. "Then you stand together. The rest of it comes when it has to." They all nodded. Some of them started taking notes, while others just held her gaze. When they had left, Kate walked back inside the schoolhouse alone. She sat down at her desk, just staring at the Remington rifle on its peg. The walnut stock of the gun caught the late afternoon light, worn smooth from many years of use. For the very first time, she asked herself the question she had been avoiding ever since the fight had ended. Who am I now? Am I the woman who taught children their sums and read them stories? Or am I the one who had to pull triggers to keep them all alive? She did not have an answer. Outside, the sounds of the children's voices rose up again, bright and unbroken. Kate just sat there with her hands folded in her lap and a distant look in her eyes. The town was thriving, but the heavy burden she now carried had no end in sight. The quiet legacy, autumn came and painted the ridge in colors of gold and crimson, and the first light snow began to fall in soft, silent flakes that dusted the rooftops of Eagle's Crossing like powdered sugar. The town had truly come alive again, not with the frantic energy of a boom, but with the steady, quiet rhythm of people who had learned the true cost of keeping what really mattered. The teachers' college had been approved. A new college was breaking ground on the hill overlooking Main Street, with its foundation stones already set firm in the earth. Down in town, Cole Ramsey's general store now had a real library nook, its shelves filled with books folks had given. Nora Hale's 2 nursing trainees went about their work at the clinic with a quiet, steady confidence. In the evenings, the sound of children playing in their yards lasted a little longer, their laughter floating on the chilly air. As dusk settled, Kate Landry sat on the schoolhouse steps, holding a small piece of chalk. Weeks before, she had pulled the old, heavy blackboard out into the yard, gave it a fresh coat of paint, and made sure it was sturdy. Now she wrote a few words across its dark surface in her neat handwriting. Strength equals protection plus community. The idea was simple and clear as the first snowflakes began to fall, melting in faint streaks on the slate. Nora Hale came out from the kitchen, still wearing her apron from fixing supper, and sat down beside her. For a while, neither woman spoke, just pulling their shawls tighter as they watched the town settle in for the night, seeing lamps flicker to life in the windows and hearing the far-off clang of a blacksmith's hammer, slowing for the day, along with the gentle lowing of cattle in their pens. Cody Blaine was leading a small group of the younger children across the yard, teaching them a tune Kate had made up after the fight. The words were simple, all about folks sticking together, and about hard choices that hurt but were necessary to keep the light burning. Their high, clear voices rose in the twilight, carried on the wind. Kate listened, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. Her eyes drifted to the Remington rifle hanging on the wall just inside the open schoolhouse door. It was always there, cleaned and oiled, never far from her reach. She did not grab for it in a panic anymore, but she never considered putting it away either. Nora finally broke the silence. Do you ever wish it had gone another way? Kate looked down at the piece of chalk, turning it over and over in her fingers. No, she said after a long moment. She had no regrets, only a deep sorrow that the lesson had to be learned in such a hard fashion. She glanced back at the blackboard. One person taking a stand can make a difference, but only if other people are willing to stand right there with them. Nora nodded her head slowly. You taught them that lesson, every last one of them. A letter had arrived from Claravos that very morning. It was on official paper from the territorial capital. The letter thanked Kate by her full name, called Eagle's Crossing a true model for the frontier, and promised money and help for the new college. Kate read it through 2 times, then carefully folded it and put it away in her desk. It was an opportunity for sure, but it also came with a heavy weight. The story of Swift Kate had now traveled far beyond the town's ridge. It was being told in whispers in other settlements, with folks sending requests for training, their eyes turning toward her as if she held some great secret to staying alive. She did not have any secrets. She had only done what had to be done, and it had cost her the simple, quiet life she had once pictured for herself. The children finished their song and scampered inside for their supper. Cody stopped at the doorway, looking back at Kate with that same serious expression he had worn ever since the fight. Miss Landry, he called out. Are you coming inside? She gave him a real smile this time, even if it did not quite light up her eyes. In just a minute. He nodded and went inside. Kate got to her feet slowly, brushing the snowflakes from her skirt. She walked over to the blackboard, wiped the equation clean with her sleeve, and then wrote it again, carefully adding one more word. One word rested beneath it all: responsibility. She stepped away, watching the white flakes settle on the new chalk marks. Nora rose from her seat and came to stand right beside her. You holding up all right? Kate let out a long breath that turned to mist in the cold air. I am here. The two women stood together in the quiet as the snowfall grew thicker, coming down soft and steady. The town lights seemed to glow warmer now. There were lanterns in the windows, and the faint scent of wood smoke and supper cooking drifted by on the wind. The voices of children carried from the school kitchen, bright and full of life. Kate reached through the open door and touched the Remington, her fingers brushing against the smooth walnut stock. It would always stay there, not as a memory of glory, but as a reminder of the price that was paid. She turned to Nora, speaking in a low voice. Some legends do not just fade away. They just change their shape. Nora did not reply immediately. She looked out at the town, at the foundation being laid for the new college, the shelves in the library, the children safe inside. And then her eyes fell back on Kate. "You changed your shape too," she said softly. Kate gave a small, slow nod. Her eyes looked off into the distance, shadowed by the echo of gunfire that still visited her in dreams. But she stood up straight, her shoulders squared against the bitter cold. The town carried on. It was stronger, quieter, and a little bit wiser. Children were learning their letters, and Kate, the teacher, the protector, the woman who had settled the debt, she remained, not as some hero carved from stone. She was just a woman who stood tall when it mattered most and would carry the weight of that choice forever. The snow continued its gentle, relentless fall, covering the old scars of winter in a clean blanket of white. "Finally, I want to send my deepest thanks to all of you. Your being here means more than you will ever know. If the story you heard today stirred something deep inside of you, please do not let the trail go cold right here. There are so many more tales of courage, deep devotion, and unwavering faith just waiting to be told. Go on and subscribe, leave a comment, share it with your friends, and be sure to come on back as we continue this unforgettable journey together. Thank you so much, I truly mean it." A legal disclaimer notice follows. All stories are created for the sole purpose of entertainment and may contain scenarios that are fictionalized or dramatized based on historical settings. While artificial intelligence provides assistance in our production, human creators oversee and fine-tune every single piece to ensure sincerity, credibility, and true emotional quality. We follow all platform regulations concerning assisted content completely, making certain there are no deep fakes or any misleading images. All licensed materials are used in a responsible manner. Republishing, altering, or taking any content without getting authorization is not permitted. We sure do appreciate every single viewer who respects originality and the creative effort we put in.